The wind came hard off the canyon, a dry roar that scraped through cottonwood limbs and rattled the frost-bitten windows of the sod house. Snow had not yet fallen, but the ground was stiff with old ice, the kind that cracked underfoot and stung the nostrils with its quiet threat. In the lee of the chimney, beneath a sky the color of iron, a woman crouched over a small pile of kindling, her fingers raw and red as she struck flint to steel. The flame caught barely. A whisper of smoke curled upward and vanished into the wind. She shielded it with her body, letting it lick at the broken twigs, coaxing them like an old mother with a sick child. Her skirts were stiff with cold layered over woolen leggings, and her breath smoked out before her mouth in uneven clouds. Her name was Martha, though no one had spoken it aloud in weeks. Inside her 2 boys lay curled under a patchwork of horse blankets and rough cotton quilts. Jesse 5 had coughed through the night, a deep, wet sound that came from somewhere too low in the chest. Eli, just turned 7, had not cried, but his lips were pale and cracked, and he no longer asked for food. Their cheeks burned with fever. Their skin stayed cold. The fire took finally. She added thicker wood and carried the lit bundle in her arms, trembling from the effort. The hearthstone cracked as she dropped it in, and sparks leapt up with a hiss. She sank beside the stove and rested her forehead against the iron. It was still warm from the last embers. She had rationed the last of the coal before dawn hours before. In the corner of the room a sack of beans sat empty-mouthed, yawning open like a cut. A single heel of cornbread wrapped in linen was all that remained on the shelf, and she had already told the boys it was for Christmas. A lie. She had not seen another soul in over 10 days. Her neighbor's land had been silent, and the snow had covered any tracks before she thought to look. Her husband had died the winter before, crushed beneath the axle of a freight wagon between Rollins and the pass. They said he died quick. She hadn't known for sure until the horse came back without him, reins dragging the saddle dusted with blood. Afterward there was no burial. Just a pine box paid for by another man's coin, and a promise the undertaker had not kept. She curled around her sons that night, held them so close she could feel each uneven breath and the shudder beneath the fevered skin. She sang, though her voice was hoarse and cracked. Red River Valley, Shady Grove, old songs from a life that felt too far behind her now to reach. At some point Jesse's fingers found hers in the dark. He didn't speak. Neither did she. In the deepest part of the night, when the wind screamed through the chimney and the roof creaked like it might lift off into the black sky, Martha rose and went outside. Her boots cracked the thin crust of ice, and the air hit her face like a slap. She walked to the bluff, the place where the land dropped sudden and sharp into the gulch below. Somewhere beyond the black ridge lay the trail. She stared at it until her eyes blurred, then dropped to her knees. She did not pray with words. She simply knelt in the snow, arms limp at her sides, throat tight, eyes closed. The silence was total except for the wind and the sound of her own blood thudding in her ears. There was no miracle. No light broke the horizon. But after a time, she stood, went back inside, and lay between her sons once more. At dawn, a dog barked. She bolted upright. Jesse stirred beside her. Through the frost-laced window a shape emerged, first shadow, then color, then man. A mule. A rider hunched against the cold, wrapped in a duster and wool scarf, eyes narrow against the glare. Martha did not speak. She moved slowly, hand gripping the fire poker as she opened the door. The man raised a hand in greeting, dismounted, and stood still. "You Martha Devlin?" he asked, voice muffled. She nodded. He glanced at the window, saw the children, then back at her. "Been looking for this place 3 days," he said. "Doctor down from Walden. Name's Henry Talbot. Sent by Reverend Ellis." She blinked. Her mouth opened, closed again. He looked at her hands. "You're near froze." "I thought no one was coming," she whispered. "Wrong," he said simply. Then softer, "Let's get those boys warm." The mule stamped in the snow while Henry unpacked a battered canvas bag from its side. He moved without wasting a motion, his boots crunching over the ice-crusted ground, shoulders hunched against the cold. Martha watched from the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, trying not to shiver. She hadn't expected him to come inside without asking, but he did, ducking under the low lintel and pausing just long enough to let his eyes adjust to the gloom. The warmth from the fire barely touched the air. The walls held the cold like memory. He set his bag beside the stove and glanced at the children. "Who's worse?" She swallowed. "Jesse, the younger one. Fever came on 2 nights ago. He hasn't eaten since." Henry knelt beside the boy, his knees hitting the floor hard. He unwrapped the blankets with care, his hands practiced gentle in a way that did not match his weather-worn face. He pressed a hand to Jesse's forehead, then leaned in to listen to his breathing. Martha stood behind him, arms tight around her ribs, heart punching against bone. "Pneumonia likely," he said after a moment, "but not deep yet. He's holding on. And Ellie, fever's lighter. Could be nothing. Could be the same thing coming slow." She looked away, blinking fast. Her hands were shaking. Henry rose and moved back to his bag. "Got quinine and mustard powder. A bit of laudanum, if it gets worse. I'll need hot water. We're low on wood. Where's your stack?" She hesitated. "Gone." He didn't respond right away, just straightened up and went back outside. She watched through the window as he moved around the edge of the house, then disappeared around the lean-to. When he returned, he was dragging a bundle of chopped logs tied with rope and dusted in snow. He brought them in, dropped them by the hearth, and crouched to stoke the fire without asking. "You carry that with you." "Always," he said. "Some folks need more than medicine." By mid-morning, the cabin was warmer. Martha boiled water and cleaned Jesse's face with a rag. The boy stirred now and then, though his eyes stayed closed. Henry worked in silence, dosing small amounts of medicine between sips of broth that Martha had made from snow melt and the last bit of marrow from a cracked bone she'd saved in desperation. She didn't speak unless she had to. He didn't ask why. When the boys were asleep, Henry stood and rolled his sleeves. "I'll take a look at your roof while there's light." "You don't have to." "Yeah," he said, already at the door. "I do." She watched him work from the window. He moved slow but steady, clearing snow, reinforcing the weakest part near the chimney with rough-hewn branches he'd pulled from his mule's pack. She hadn't seen a man work like that since before Tom died. No fuss. No talk. When he came back in, his cheeks were red with wind and his mustache rimmed in frost. He wiped his hands on a cloth and looked around. "You eaten?" She shook her head before she could stop herself. He unwrapped a bundle from his coat, dried apples, a bit of smoked venison, half a loaf of coarse bread. Martha stared. "You can't." "I can," he said. "You'll be no help to them dead on your feet." She sat slowly and ate in silence. He didn't watch her, just fed the fire, checked the boys, and finally took a seat on the floor with his back to the wall. For a long while, the only sounds were the wind outside and the crackle of the flames. "You're Reverend Ellis? He sent you just for me?" she asked, her voice rough. "Not just for you," Henry said, "but close enough." He remembered. He nodded. "Said you'd helped his sister last spring, with a birth gone sideways." Martha looked at the fire, the food half-eaten in her lap. "People remember kindness," he said. She didn't answer, but something shifted inside her. Not trust. Not yet. Just enough to hold off the cold a little longer. Hope is fragile, but it survives when carried together. Subscribe and share in it. That night the wind dropped. The silence was heavy but not empty. The fire held, casting long shadows on the log walls, flickering across the boys' flushed faces. Jesse whimpered in his sleep once, but the tight rattle in his chest had eased just a little. Martha sat beside him, one hand resting lightly on his back, the other cupped around a tin mug of broth she hadn't drunk. Henry dozed in the corner, his coat still on, hat pulled low over his brow. He hadn't asked for a blanket, hadn't expected one either. When morning broke pale and gray, Martha stepped out into the snow with the axe. Her skirts caught on the frozen weeds by the porch, but she didn't stop. The woodpile Henry had brought in was already half gone. She found a narrow stand of lodgepole pine behind the cabin trees, brittle and young but dry enough to split. She hacked at the trunk until her arms burned and her breath came out in sharp clouds. It took nearly an hour to drag one down another, to break it into pieces. Her palms blistered fast. She didn't cry. By the time she returned, Henry had brewed tea and fed Ellie a thin porridge. Jessie still slept. Henry didn't speak when he saw her come in with the wood, just nodded and added it to the stack near the stove. Later, they walked the perimeter of the property. He asked about her boundaries, about fences, about her well. "It's half frozen," she said. "I've been melting snow. You'll need to clear it before deep winter hits. Can't dig when it's solid." "I know. You've got grit," he said. She gave him a look. "I've got mouths to feed." He smiled faintly. "Same thing?" That evening, as dusk crept in and the boys dozed beneath quilts warmed by bricks from the fire, Martha stitched a torn hem with numb fingers, while Henry cleaned his saddle gear. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't distance anymore, just space. Breathing room. "You have a family?" she asked, not looking up. He paused. "Had. Wife died in childbirth. Son with her. I'm sorry. Been 4 years. Some days I think I still see her. In town. On the road. Just for a second." Martha tied off the thread. "I know that feeling." They didn't speak again for a while. Before bed, Henry stood at the door, looking out across the frozen yard. The stars were out, brittle points of light, sharp and clear. "I'll head out in the morning," he said. "Once the boy's fever breaks for good, you're welcome to stay." He turned. "You sure?" She nodded. "I am." That night she slept sitting up, Jessie curled against her chest. Henry didn't lie down. He stayed near the stove, feeding it every hour, quiet and watchful. By dawn the fever had broken. Jessie stirred, opened his eyes, and said her name. She wept without sound, her face buried in his hair. By midday, Jessie sat upright, his thin arms draped around his knees, eyes hazy but alert. Martha pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, felt only warmth now, no fire. She gave him half a spoon of the broth Henry had left steeping by the hearth, and kissed the crown of his head. Eli played quietly with a bit of string near the window, the color back in his cheeks. The wind had calmed. The sky outside was wide and dry, the kind of cold that cracked lips but brought no storm. Henry packed slowly. His bedroll, medicine satchel, bits of jerky and hardtack. He moved with the same steady pace. He'd arrived with no rush, no delay. Martha watched him from the corner of the room, hands wrapped around a steaming tin mug, her raw fingers finally still. "You heading to Walden?" she asked. He nodded. "South first, then west. I follow the call." "You always travel alone?" "Mostly. Sometimes folks ride along a stretch, but most don't stay." "Hard way to live." He shrugged. "Not the hardest." They stood in the quiet. The boys dozed again, a safe, dreamless kind of sleep. Martha pulled her shawl tighter. Her feet ached. Her shoulders slumped with the slow return of rest. "You could stay longer," she said. "Plenty to fix around here. If you wanted work." Henry met her eyes. "You offering charity?" "I'm offering shelter." He seemed to weigh that one boot scuffing the edge of the hearthstone. "I've got a team coming up from the flats in a week," he said. "A doctor's wagon. Meant to meet them, keep heading west. You could send word. Catch them later." "I could." They said nothing for a while. Then he set his pack down again. That afternoon they repaired the chicken coop together. The hens had mostly scattered after Tom died, but 2 remained wild and stubborn, roosting in the rafters. Henry braced the frame while Martha hammered the warped slats back into place. Her hands shook, but she didn't miss a strike. "You learned this?" before he asked, holding a plank in place. "My father built wagons in Missouri. Taught me what he could." "And your husband?" "Tom was strong," she said, "but not good with wood. Broke more than he fixed." Henry smiled, then caught himself. At sundown they stood outside. The sky burned orange and red behind the black ridgeline. Jessie's cough had faded to a whisper. Eli had asked for cornbread. Martha's arms hung heavy at her sides, her body bruised from the inside out. But she was upright, breathing. "Will you ride with me into town tomorrow?" Henry asked. "I need supplies. You might need something too. I haven't left this place since spring." "Then it's time." She nodded once. The next morning they loaded the wagon. Henry brought his mule alongside the old draft horse Tom had raised from a colt. It still remembered the yoke. Martha wore a clean apron, patched but neat, her hair braided back. The boys waved from the porch, wrapped in blankets, faces pink with health and cold. They rode side by side, not touching, not speaking much. The road was rutted and rimmed with frost, but it held, and so did they. The trail into town was a rough one, a thin frozen line that wove through cottonwood groves and over dry creek beds. The sun hung low, pale gold against the hard blue of the sky, and the mule's breath came in puffs that rose like smoke. Martha sat stiff-backed on the wagon bench, her hands tight on the reins, though Henry handled the lead most of the way. They spoke little. Now and then he pointed out tracks, elk, coyote, once a bear. She nodded, eyes scanning the trees as if the forest might remember her. It had been nearly 8 months since she'd left the homestead. The land felt larger now, wilder. When the first rooftops of Walden came into view, something in her gut twisted. She felt the edge of shame rise, how thin she looked, how worn her clothes had become. How long it had been since she'd stood among people. But Henry said nothing, just guided the mule through the main road like he belonged, and by his calm she sat a little straighter. The town hadn't changed. The mercantile still leaned a little to one side. Smoke curled from the blacksmith shop, and the livery stable stood wide open, half full with wagons and saddle horses. Folks glanced their way but didn't gawk. 1 or 2 nodded familiar. No one asked anything. Inside the store, Martha moved slow, her eyes flicking from sack to shelf. Sugar, salt, flour, dried apples. She moved like someone coming up from water, unsure whether to breathe. "You've got credit with Ellis," the shopkeeper said, not unkind. "He told me to extend whatever you need." She stared at him. "I didn't ask for that." "No, but he gave it anyway." Henry set down a tin of coffee beside her. "Take it." She didn't argue. Afterward, they stood outside on the boardwalk, arms full of bundles. A boy offered to load the wagon for a penny. Henry paid him with a quiet nod. "You hungry?" he asked. She hesitated. "Yes." They ate at the calf potatoes, salt pork, and dry biscuits. Nothing fancy, but hot. Martha didn't realize how cold her bones had been until they weren't anymore. Across from her, Henry poured coffee into a chipped mug, silent. "You always help people like this?" she asked. He shrugged. "I don't keep count." "Why not?" He looked out the window toward the mountains. "No one kept count for me." The words sat heavy between them. Later, when the wagon was loaded and the sky dimmed toward twilight, Martha paused beside the post office. A single letter sat in her coat pocket unopened for months. From Tom's sister in Cheyenne. She'd never written back. Now she reached for a scrap of paper and scribbled a short reply, nothing more than "The boys are alive, we are managing, I am still here." She handed it to the clerk and turned back toward the street where Henry waited, reins in hand. The ride home was quieter still. The sun sank fast and the frost returned to the air. Somewhere near the halfway mark, Henry spoke. "You didn't ask about my next stop. I figured if you wanted to tell me you would. I don't know where it is yet." She looked over at him, her face calm. "You could stay through winter. That an offer." "It's not charity," she said. "There's work. And company, if that matters." He looked ahead at the trail, then at her, the soft lines of her jaw lit by the fading light. He nodded once. "I reckon I'll stay." They reached the homestead after dark. The boys ran to meet them, feet thudding on the porch, blankets flying. Martha climbed down stiffly and gathered them close, one on each side. Henry stood by the mule, his breath rising into the stars. Inside, the fire still held. The cabin was warm. She lit the lamp. He closed the door. Neither spoke, but something had settled between them, quiet, steady, and real. Winter deepened. Snow came in slow storms that blanketed the valley and silenced everything but the wind. The days shortened to pale hours, the nights long and blue with cold. But the cabin held. The fire stayed lit. Henry chopped wood in the mornings while Martha boiled water and mended what could be saved, blankets, shirts, the hem of Jessie's coat. The boys improved quickly. They still coughed some nights, but they ate with hunger, now played games with small stones and carved sticks. Eli began writing his letters again, slow and careful, at the edge of the table. Martha watched them from the stove one evening, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, her back sore but whole. Henry sat near the door, sanding the stock of a rifle he'd found under the floorboards, a leftover from Tom, half rusted and forgotten. "I didn't think we'd make it," she said, her voice low. He looked up. "But you did." "I'm not sure how." "You kept going. That's how." She gave him a long, steady glance. "I wouldn't have." He didn't argue. That night they played cards by lamplight. Eli counted out the hands. Jessie stacked the pennies they used for betting. Henry let them win. Martha smiled once, just once, and it changed her face completely. It wasn't youth or ease that returned to her. It was something stronger. Something earned. Later, while the boys slept and the fire snapped low, Henry stood near the door, coat in hand. "You leaving again?" she asked. "No. Just checking the barn." She moved closer. "You don't have to explain yourself." He hesitated. "I've stayed longer here than I meant to." "You're welcome longer still." Their eyes met in the lamplight, the space between them full of all the words they weren't ready to speak. He touched the brim of his hat and stepped outside. Martha stood there a while, one hand resting on the back of a chair. Her heart beat hard, not with fear but with something quieter, something warm. She exhaled. Snow fell through the night, thick and clean. In the morning the world looked new. They worked together through December, built a fence for the chickens, repaired the sled. Martha helped Henry patch the roof of the barn with salvaged timber, her hands chapped and calloused, her breath visible in the cold. One afternoon Henry showed her how to fire the old rifle. They stood out behind the bluff, wind sharp against their faces. "You ever shoot before?" he asked. "My father taught me when I was young." "Before he died." He handed her the rifle, watching her grip. "This one kicks." She squared her feet, narrowed her eyes, and fired. The shot echoed across the valley. The tin can she aimed for toppled off the fence post. Henry smiled. "Not bad. I remember things when I need to," she said. He nodded once. That's the best way to survive. That night she found him outside sitting near the barn with his back to the wall watching the stars. She sat beside him without a word, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "They're saying it'll be a long winter," he said. "I've made it through worse." He turned to her. "You want me to stay until spring?" She didn't answer right away. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "I want you to stay as long as you mean it." He looked at her, not with pity, not with longing, but with something steadier. "I do," he said. She nodded. Inside, the fire burned slow and deep. The boys dreamed. The land slept. January came hard. The kind of cold that froze breath to your scarf and splintered fence posts from the inside out. Mornings broke with a deep silence. The snow laid smooth and untouched like paper, waiting for a hand to write something true across it. They woke early, not out of choice but habit. The kind that sticks when you've come close to losing everything. Henry stoked the fire while Martha boiled water with hands wrapped in rags. The boys slept a little longer now, their bodies catching up to what hunger had stolen. Jesse had color in his cheeks again. Eli was carving figures from old pine scraps, careful, patient, never asking for praise. Henry slept in the barn, though she had asked him not to. Said the cabin was warmer, the cot in the corner long since cleared. But he stayed out there anyway, under his own roof, his own stars. Martha didn't press. She understood a man needed his own kind of quiet sometimes. They worked in rhythm now. He patched fence posts. She baked bread from the new flour and set traps near the ravine for rabbits. When they spoke, it was about useful things, how to reinforce the barn door, when to plant in spring, whether it would be worth riding into town for more lamp oil. But sometimes their talk drifted to things that didn't matter and did. "My mother used to say winter told the truth about a person," Martha said once while sewing by lamplight. Henry didn't look up from the boots he was oiling. She was right. She used to say snow didn't hide things. It exposed them. He nodded, then glanced at her. "What's it told you about me?" She didn't answer at first. "Then that you don't scare easy, and you don't talk unless it matters." He smiled just a little. "And you—" She met his eyes. "That I'm still standing." There were no grand moments, no sudden declaration, just small things. He fixed the rattle in the stovepipe without being asked. She packed a bit of jerky into his coat pocket when he rode out to check the river. He brought back a bag of nails without her mentioning they were running low. She mended his shirt, the one with the torn sleeve he kept wearing anyway. They laughed once, only once, but it came loud and real when Jesse tried to ride the old goat around the yard and landed face first in a snowdrift. Henry doubled over with it. Martha's face lit up in a way that stunned even her. That night she found a small bundle near the stove, a carved horse for Eli, a rabbit for Jesse, and a hairpin plain smooth wood for her. No note. No words. She held it in her hand long after the boys were asleep, the fire casting slow gold light across the floor. She didn't ask why. She didn't have to. Outside, the snow had stopped. The stars were sharp and close. She walked to the door, opened it, and stood there in the cold. After a moment, she heard the soft crunch of boots behind her. Henry's voice was quiet. "I've been thinking about spring." She didn't turn around. "What about it? Staying?" She looked out toward the dark trees, her heart loud but steady. "I'd like that," she said. He stood beside her, not touching, just close enough to share the cold. Inside, the cabin glowed. By February, the snow had begun to soften. Not melt, not yet, but shift. Settle. The drifts no longer creaked underfoot like dry timber. They gave a little now, as if the earth below was waking, groaning back into life. Martha noticed first the sound of water under ice, the way the wind no longer cut but whispered. the icicles dripping slow steady from the eaves. The boys grew restless. Eli begged to check the traps. Jesse asked if the creek would run again soon. Martha let them out longer each day, their boots wrapped in scraps of wool and old twine to keep the cold off. They kicked snow at each other, shouted at the sky. They were still thin, but their laughter was full. One morning Henry came in with a gash on his hand. Split it, hauling a log that had frozen into the ground. Martha pulled him to the wash basin without a word. She cleaned it slow and careful, her fingers strong against his. "You've got a rough touch," he said, wincing. "You've got thin skin." He laughed. Not loud, but real. She wrapped it tight, then held his hand a moment longer than needed. His eyes met hers. No words, just breath close between them. Later that day he asked about Tom. She didn't flinch, just wiped her hands on her apron and sat by the fire. He was stubborn, she said. Worked himself to bone. Never thought it'd catch up to him. Then one day it did. "You loved him." She nodded. But it was a hard kind of love. Not gentle. Henry sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "Did he treat you well?" She looked into the flames. "Not always. But I think he tried." They sat with that for a long while. It didn't hang heavy. It just stayed. That night the wind came up again, but not sharp, more like breath moving through tall grass. The fire burned low. The boys slept early. Henry stood at the door, one hand on the latch. "Brings close," he said. She nodded. "I know. I've got a choice to make." She waited. Ride on with the doctor's wagon or stay and build something else? Her voice was steady. "I won't ask. I know." He looked at her like he was memorizing something. Then he stepped outside. She didn't follow. But the next morning he was still there. Boots by the door. Fire already going. Her coffee poured. No fanfare. No question. Just presence. Martha watched him from the stove, the boys chattering over bread and jam behind her. She reached into her apron and pulled out the hairpin. Slid it into her braid. Tied it off. Then she poured 2 mugs. Handed him one, and sat beside him like it had always been this way. March brought thaw. The ground still held patches of old snow curled at the edges like paper gone damp. But streams trickled again and birds returned in small flocks, their calls echoing through the bare trees like memory. The smell of earth crept in, wet, cold, alive. Martha stepped out one morning and found buds swelling along the cottonwoods. Her breath caught, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because she'd forgotten what hope looked like when it wasn't laced with fear. Inside, Henry was laying plans. He'd sketched out a lean-to for the animals, a new fence line, and shelves for the root cellar. The boys hovered close when he worked, watching, asking, offering clumsy help that he accepted without a sigh. "I could dig fence posts," Eli said. "You can mark where they go," Henry replied. "That's where it starts." Jesse, too small for the work, still insisted on carrying nails and a tin cup. When he dropped them, Henry just knelt beside him, helped pick them up, never rushed. Martha noticed the quiet things. Henry never raised his voice. He took to her routines without question, boiling water in the mornings, oiling hinges at dusk, tying the latch just so. He moved like someone who had no need to be the center of anything, only to belong. One afternoon, while the boys napped in the sun like pups, she sat beside him under the lean-to frame, watching him wrap leather around the handle of a spade. "You ever think about settling before this?" He didn't look up. Thought about it too much. Never had reason to do it. "And now," he tied the strip off with a firm tug, "now I do." She watched his hands for a while, then reached over, touched the back of one light as a falling leaf. "I want to build something here, not just keep surviving." He turned to her, quiet. "With me. With you." He didn't smile, not fully, but something in his face softened deep and lasting. That night they cleared the corner where Tom's old books had sat gathering dust. Martha sorted through them slow, setting aside what might still be read. Henry built a new shelf for them, sanded smooth, stained with boiled pine resin. He didn't ask what the books meant to her. He just made space. Spring came in fits. Snow, then sun. Rain that turned the ground to thick muck, then dried to crust in a single afternoon. But the days stretched longer and the cabin felt less like a place to hide and more like a place to begin. On the first Sunday in April, Henry rode into town with the boys. They brought back seed potatoes, a new saw, and a bundle wrapped in linen. Martha opened it carefully, 4 yards of blue calico soft to the touch. "You said you hadn't sewn for yourself in years," Henry said. She traced the fabric with her fingers, then looked up. "I didn't have a reason. You do now." She stood and folded it against her chest. "I think I'll make something for summer," she said. Later, while the boys chased each other around the co-op and Henry repaired the wheelbarrow, she stood at the door and watched them, all her children, the man she hadn't expected, the land coming back to life. No vows were spoken, nothing written, but it was there, a family, a future, and enough silence between them to grow something true. The days unfolded soft and slow. Morning frost turned to dew. Shoots of green pushed through the garden bed. Henry and Martha dug together, their knees in the damp earth, hands black with soil. Jessie planted crooked rows of onion and carrot seed, proud beyond measure. Eli built a scarecrow with Henry's help, stuffed with straw, dressed in an old coat, his face a careful charcoal smudge. There was laughter often. Nothing loud or giddy, just small bursts that came naturally like breath. Martha hung laundry in the wind one morning, the blue calico dress she'd sewn swaying gently at the line's end. It wasn't fancy, just neat, sturdy, made for work. But when she wore it later that week, stepping out of the cabin with the late sun behind her, Henry's hands stilled mid-task. He didn't say anything, just looked, then nodded once, like something inside him had settled. That evening, while the boys played at the edge of the field with sticks and stones, she brought out 2 mugs of chicory coffee and sat beside him on the porch. They watched the light stretch long across the land. "I thought maybe it would all break again," she said. "That none of it could hold." "It can," he said. "It just needs tending." She looked out at the fence they'd mended, the barn they'd patched, the path they'd worn between porch and coop, well-trodden and true. "There was a time," she said, "when I wished I'd never come west." He didn't answer. "But I was wrong." He turned to her. "This place didn't take everything from me," she said. "It gave me room to find out who I was when I wasn't someone's wife, or daughter, or burden." He met her gaze. "And who are you?" She smiled, small and sure. "Someone who can hold what's hers." They sat there a long while, the sky folding into dusk. The boys drifted inside, quiet with sleep. Henry stood, offered her his hand. "Come see something." She followed him out past the bluff, to the edge of the field where the land dropped down into the shallow gulch. In the dim light he pointed to a small clearing marked with 4 stones. Rough, uncut, simple. "Your husband's?" she asked. He nodded. "And my boy. My wife." She stepped closer. "You brought them with you." "I couldn't leave them behind." "Not really." Martha bent down, ran her fingers along the edge of one stone. "We could plant something here. Wildflowers. Or a tree." Henry's voice was quiet. "That would be good." They stood together a moment more, then turned back toward the cabin, walking in step. Inside, the fire had burned low. The night was full of soft sounds, wind in the cottonwoods, the creak of wood settling, the breath of sleeping boys. Martha pulled the bolt across the door, then turned. Henry stood near the table, the lamplight catching the silver at his temples, the calm in his eyes. No promises, she said, voice steady. Only the work, the choosing. Each day. He stepped toward her. I'll choose it, he said. Every day. She reached for his hand. Worn. Calloused. Strong. They stood there joined in the quiet. Outside spring kept coming. Inside love had taken root, not in grand words or sudden fire, but in the steady warmth of two lives mending side by side. Do not leave this road alone. Subscribe and walk it with us step by step.